Hey, hello, virtual Heidelberg. This is a audiovisual podcast-like recording. It's the reenactment of a talk I held a while ago at the Heidelberg Kunstverein in the great exhibition by Agnes Scherer. It was called Aufgerüstete Männlichkeit. This time it's going to be in English, and it's going to be called Metallic Moral Masculinities, Moral Metal Masculinities, as you will. And I'm gonna think through a couple of things related to how I perceive discourses around weaponized and moral masculinities today. Right. I'm gonna do this in 3 steps. The first step is going to be looking at what Sayak Valencia, fantastic philosopher from Mexico, describes as the form and formation of necromasculinity, a situation, a scenario in which you will find monster men identifying with their own monstrosity and turning death into a global business. In the second part, I will move on to look at what I want to call the teachings of the performer and meditate a little bit on my own childhood fascination with a rogue knight with a lot of mechanical gadgets enhancing his improvised performances, namely the character of Boba Fett from Star Wars. So subtitle for the second section is going to be Monsieur Boba Fett, c'est moi. And in the third part, I will look at how these kind of metal men currently reappear as arbiters of a morality precisely in the moment when the question is being asked, how will patriarchy end? And can the honorable man be an agent in the handover of power from the patriarch to the female leader that will follow? So these are the 3 discursive islands I'm gonna jump across. I will approach these questions in a very different manner. Part 2 and part 3 are built around the memories of my own relations. They are potentially quite embarrassing testimony to how my own sense of masculinity has been built around certain ideas of chivalry and let's say being a rogue knight with a lot of machinic appliances, improvising his way through life, but bound by a code of honor and a code of chivalry. These are part 2 and part 3. And here I will rely mostly on layering images to feel out the space, a space of formation. I hesitate to call it a space of identification. I would rather love to call it a space of attraction. I want to speak about the images, the sounds, and the tactilities, the materialities that attracted me as a kid to wish to imitate, to mimic a particular kind of chivalrous improvising masculinity. So while this is originating in the world of my experienced relations, the first point, Sayak Valencia's thoughts on necromasculinity and gore capitalism, do not originate from the world of my first-hand experiences. So therefore I find it important to start by saying I wish to set a boundary between the words I can relate and those which I cannot relate. I cannot tell the story of necromasculinity straightforwardly. I'm not in a position to speak about all the many men who are soldiers who turn death into business. on the one hand, I cannot relate their story because I have not entered this universe. When I was being drafted to go to the army, I refused and was trained as a nurse instead of a soldier. Secondly, I feel I cannot relate because whatever I say in my own Generation X, soul-searching, masculinity, dismantling ways, or deconstructing, I don't know if we ever succeeded, I suspect not. Based on these thoughts and perspectives, I feel I have no right and I'm in no place to comment on anybody and everybody who's found themselves in a life of becoming a militarized man monster machine. I'm in no place to comment on that. At the same time, I cannot not relate either, because pretty much everything I'm going to try and say is overshadowed what I would agree with Sayak Valencia is probably one of the most dominant discourses of masculinity at the moment. So there is no way you can continue or attempt the deconstruction of a certain idea of chivalrous, improvised masculinity a la Generation X without also taking into account one of the most prominent, dominant, and overbearing discourse of masculinity, which I agree with Sayak Valencia is probably that of necromasculinity today. So while I am in no place to speak from experience, I'm also in no place to disregard the fact that everything I'm going to say is overshadowed by necromasculinity and the way it shapes the world today in many, many ways, and has probably already shaped the world when, as a kid, I was identifying with the rogue knight Boba Fett, and in that moment already acknowledging some form of inherent specialized violence, as Sayak Valencia calls it, with that man, that knight with many arms and rocket packs and what have you. Okay, this is just a preliminary remark. The conditions of my own irrelevance, if you will, are set by the prominence of a discourse of necromasculinity, which I'm going to try to approach through the perspective, through the lens of Sayak Valencia's writing. And then in part 2 and 3, I'm going to start layering images to feel out the space of becoming that I feel like, yes, that I have inhabited until now, in the hope that at least with, certainly with part 2 and 3, I want to risk a certain kind of embarrassment, which in the end, if it's mine, that's good. And if someone feels touched by it, and we share that moment of embarrassment, then all the better, I guess. So that's how it's going to go. Necromasculinity, the teachings of the performer, and the chivalrous handover of power. How will patriarchy end? There we go. And just to start with one image that probably has a bearing on all of these discourses, I thought like we could have a quick look at Uccello's scene here, which I remember I saw as a kid when on vacation with my parents in London. And already as a kid, it struck me as extraordinarily strange, because the picture here is making all kinds of offers, if you will, and the offers are really confusing, because on a certain way a plot is being suggested, but the picture itself massively undermines the very plot it proposes. Yes, we have a plot that celebrates the moral victory of a metal man, probably over his own desire, as he pierces that strange dragon and supposedly liberates the lady at its side. Chivalrous, all sealed up in shiny metal, barely recognizable as a person because you don't see much of his face, and what you see is not particularly interesting, really. So I found that confusing as a kid. Why should we stick to the plot here when the seeming protagonist, the active protagonist of the plot, seems so pale in comparison to what is the center of actual attraction, namely the bleeding dragon with its fantastic body that is just so tactile, with all this kind of studded, nubbed and ribbed flesh of the back, the incredibly muscular legs, the colorful wings, and highly dynamic corkscrew tail there. And how fascinating it is that it's just almost like a lap dog to the lady who holds the dragon by this tiny, slim rope that doesn't seem to hold her hostage. It's rather like she's holding the dragon as if the dragon was a pet that was there to protect her, not to hold her captive. And the lady with her sharp toed red shoes and the amazingly expressive face and this strangely ambivalent gesture of her hand is as fascinating as the dragon. And rather than confirming the plot that her task here is to just remain calm until she gets saved, she seems more like she's negotiating the situation, like, why the hell do you have to hurt my beast here? Which, after all, I would agree with her, as she's pointing towards the beast is the center of all attraction here. You'd rather be the beast or with the beast than to be sealed up in a tin can, wielding a lance on the right. So confusing. No, why identify with the plot when you are actually much more attracted to the characters in the left side of the image? From an adult perspective, I would say in this pictorial space, the confusion of attractions continues, because what's going on in the background seems even wilder when on the left you have this want of a term, uteral cave. On the right side you have this kind of strangely muscular Rosetta. And but despite the fact that these two orifices or openings are being offered in the background, what's being pierced here is the nose, the dragon's nose. Why of all orifices should it be the nose that gets pierced? And as this kind of small but decisive trickle of blood seeps down from, the mouth, that would be another opening, but we can only guess that it's probably a bleeding nose. What's going on? Why is this act of aggression directed towards the orifice over the mouth, the nose? What's happening here? It's a strangely dynamic, very corporal, very tactile, pictorial zone, I would say, in which the moral plot of chivalrous saving is belied and belittled by the attractions erupting from the dragon and the lady, and this strange magnetic power of the cave, the Rosetta in the sky, the mouth of the dragon, and the bleeding nose. How bizarre that is. And I talk about it at length because I feel like on the level of the plot we could speak about conscious choices. We can consciously choose to identify with the knight who is suggested as the moral solution to all of these dilemmas suggested by the painting. Which office to pick. Then the plot suggests that the knight should be the answer, but as we would morally and consciously identify, on the other hand, the invitations that the picture extends are much more directed towards affects, affinities, and sympathies, which I don't think are subject to choice, but subject to attraction. I do not choose to be attracted by the dragon. I could choose to identify with the knight, but the fact that the dragon and the lady and all these kind of strange offices attract me is not a subject to my choices. It's the power of the picture. It's kind of the magnetism that is prevalent in this pictorial space that I expose myself to when I find myself torn between what the plot suggests and what the image provides. Yeah. So in this world of choices on the moral side of the plot, counterbalanced, belied, and belittled by the attractions enacted by the picture itself, we could on the one hand consider it an either-or situation, or much rather an or situation between, well, the plot and the picture, what the picture says, what the plot suggests, which is coincidentally something that in Discipline and Punish, when it comes to the morality of public executions, the morality of public violence, if you will, Foucault goes into it great detail. He argues that the spectacle of public executions, the spectacle of justice in the Middle Ages, in feudal times, was so highly volatile because before and beyond the moral plot that they propose, which you see on the left-hand side, the moral plot of the king arriving to punish the culprit in a scenario where the king's body is set against the culprit's body and the king prevails with absolute violence, with sovereign violence. Beyond and before that moral plot of the sovereignty of the king, there is another zone of affection that's opened up around the public execution that you can see on the right and above, which is the people talking, the people looking, the people potentially feeling drawn to and attracted by the supposed culprit, the supposed bandit, potentially much more than the king. Maybe the attractiveness, the physical presence of the culprit's body is much closer to them, so that there is always the chance, as Foucault argued, and that's why the system of theatrical violence is so volatile, that the people might turn against the symbolic plot, the symbolic authority of the king, and much rather in this space of affection express their solidarity with the culprit and identify now I'm saying it again, find themselves attracted to that body and voice their attraction by rebelling against the justice that's being brought on a symbolic plane. One famous cinematic iteration of this scenario is Bresson's Jeanne d'Arc, The Passion of Jeanne d'Arc, where we see the people realizing literally their likenesses in her face. They see their faces in her face. They're from the same kind of country folk, and that leads to an uproar, a revolution, an uprising against the symbolic narrative that justice has been done. So in that space of affinities, as Foucault has argued, the culprit, or if we stay with this kind of parallel, the dragon steals the show, becomes the subject of attraction, the point of attraction that allows people's emotions to flow in a certain direction. That is a pretext, a preparation for saying for trying to summarize what Sayak Valencia speaks about in her book Gore Capitalism, where she tries to find words to describe the rise of a certain type of necromasculinity or necro-empowerment that precisely lies in this zone, and with a rejection of all the ciphers of moral metal masculinity, and a counter-identification, a counter-attraction, I should say, to the endriago, the monster man, the man that is half snake, half dragon, half man, a third snake, a third dragon, a third man, in a deliberate, no, I shouldn't say deliberate, in where the power of the counterforce to the symbolic system of chivalrous virtue produces a template to speak of oneself as a monster man, as a man that rejects the symbolic discourse of the king's sovereignty, the state's sovereignty, the knight's moral values. She speaks of it as a form of necro-empowerment, where, if I were to paraphrase that, if you were to find yourself in a situation where your social death technically has already happened, where the powers that be relegate your existence to a sphere of redundancy, where to the system you're already dead, your life no longer signifies. She argues in that moment the only way how you might seek emancipation socially is through making that death which has befallen you symbolically, making that your career. And in that sense, consider yourself as someone attracted to the dragon, the knight's nemesis. She refers to the book Amadis de Gaula, a knight's tale, a historical knight's tale, where the knight's nemesis, the enemy to be defeated, is called endriago, a monster man made from man, dragon, and snail. And in the story, that in the moral plot of the story, the endriago is set up as that which is to be defeated, that which is to be killed, for morality to be saved, for the law to be enacted, and carefully avoiding words like bandit or gangster. Sayak Valencia proposes the endriago, the dragon, the anti-knight, if you will, the knight's nemesis, as the template and center of gravity and affection around which someone who may have already suffered their own social death builds a new kind of striving, a new character towards a necro-emancipation, being the dragon man, the monster man that is sentenced to death already, but will realize their own emancipation by becoming a person who specializes on bringing death. Here described in terms of the motif of the endriago, carefully avoiding words like gangster or bandit, if you will. And I should at this point also thank Sarah Eliasson, who actually introduced me to Sayak Valencia and brought me to this book. Yes. Continuing, what Sayak Valencia then with great accuracy describes is how this career path of identifying with the knight's nemesis, becoming the endriago subject, seeking necro emancipation, leads to a whole field of professions which she describes as violence specialists, meaning people, men who occupy a liminal space where it is not always possible to separate their work from that of the government security forces. She is specifically speaking about the specialization on violence in the context of Mexico, which he paraphrases and theorizes. But if you're reading this, it's very difficult to not also think of the immense prominence of the Wagner battalions, if you will, in the current political theater of the war in Ukraine, where everything Sayak Valencia says fits to a T when you have men already consigned to social death, having been in prison, being released, probably also knowing that the chance of their death are pretty high, but to realize that their own social death in form of becoming a militia that is sent around the world as a group of violent specialists that indeed are very difficult to separate from the government security forces. That leads Sayak Valencia to conclude that death has become one of the most profitable businesses in existence, and she shores that up by arguing that the criminal and economy is estimated to make up no less than 15% of global commerce, trying to make it clear to the reader that death as global business, the violence specialists' commitment to necro-empowerment by now is a major economical force. It's not just an exception. It's not something that could be relegated to what is metaphorically called a black market. It's not the exception from the rule. It's part of how the global economy works. It's shored up on specialized violence. She also quotes an American scholar arguing that, the invisible hand of the market doesn't exist without the fist of the military. So Sayak Valencia argues whatever we do, whatever we say is overshadowed by the prominence of necro-empowerment, specialized violence enacted by, she largely talks about man, a form of necromasculinity that emerges from seeking the only possible career as a career of specialized violence, having already been consigned to a form of social death, if you will. I think she's incredibly concise in her description and really impressive in that she refrains from any judgments and opinions on this phenomenon. She manages to neither glamorize the endriago subject nor morally condemn it. She just describes its prominence, also in economical terms, on the world stage. And I would like to agree with this and say whatever I can add from my own experiences is belied and belittled by what Sayak Valencia describes as the prominence of necro-empowerment and its economical role within a global setting. Yeah. Okay. Entering into the world of images, I believe people know, and there is in many ways in the popular imaginary and in popular language to acknowledge that the endriago subject plays a huge role in the material reality and imaginary of the politics of masculinity, of necromasculinity today. One aspect of it is the common derogatory term for both Russian and Wagner soldiers as orcs. And as you can see in this image montage here that is taken from the internet, where the orcs are another metamorphosis of the endriago, of the dragon man that is consigned to death and therefore has no other career but to bring death and seek death. And it always strikes me that in so many ways J.R.R. Tolkien is almost the anti-Karl Marx, if you will, where Karl Marx was precisely, Marx and Engels were seeking to appraise all the proletarians who had been rendered redundant as a workforce by the brutality of capitalism, and had heralded the redundant populations as the bringers of change. J.R.R. Tolkien, probably also building on the work of H.G. Wells, was describing them as the threat of the masses, of the obsolete. H.G. Wells, there's the Morlocks, those dwelling under the earth. A thin paraphrase, if not the colonial, the population suppressed in the colonies, but certainly the miners of England who were producing the resources of the soil and were constantly threatening to revolt. A source of fear for the ruling bourgeoisie. Those Morlocks became orcs. You just take out a few letters out of the name from Morlock to orc, as those earth-dwelling miners rising up against the ruling classes in their faceless, unindividuated guise of masses streaming forth from the earth. Set up by J.R.R. Tolkien and H.G. Wells as a faceless threat of unindividuated, redundant bodies, if you will, today returning in the guise of endriago subjects, as bodies streaming forth, probably knowing that they're marching towards their death, but with no other choice or like with a great attraction to seeking that path anyway. In the case of the Wagner soldiers, if we take Sayak Valencia's analysis and project it on the situation, and I constantly feel when I speak about it, I might already be overstepping that boundary I described in the beginning by speaking from a place of no experience, if you will. At the same time, there is the popular image of the Wagner militia as orcs, and obviously a war that's being waged on the stage, on the medieval stage, on the neo-feudal stage, if you will, between the king and the monster, where the affections are shifting between a man who presents himself as the sovereign, bringing justice, telling good from evil from the place of his own presidency, and his former friend and ally who in his current revolt presents himself as the ally to the underdog, the ally to the endriago subject, the ally to the orcs, the leader of the downtrodden, because he's been in jail and has worked his way up but never forgotten his true affinities, his true affiliations. All of that may be completely set up as a theatrical game, but on the stage of public violence, it seems what's playing itself out here is precisely the question: who do you feel attracted by, the person resembling the sovereign, or the person setting himself up as the one who's one with the people and the voice of all the downtrodden, the leader of the orcs, in the pictorial space of television programs and internet broadcasts, where these forces of attractions are brought into play. The question of how to speak back to these models, to this battle of competing masculinities between the sovereign who's gonna tell right from wrong, and then the leader of the downtrodden who's one with the endriago subjects, is particularly difficult, I feel, for a leftist position who embraces an idea of social justice, because it's far too easy if you intervene in this scenario of picturings, of projections, to come across as a moralist who is in no place to speak. One could probably argue that one of the, not death blows, but one of the biggest setbacks in the process of Hillary Clinton seeking the presidency in the States was the moment when, shortly before the election, she spoke of Trump supporters as a basket of deplorables, pointing to all those people, men mostly, who consider themselves redundant. A commonplace way of putting it would probably be white trash, identifying with Trump, much as one would probably do with Prigozhin, as a leader of the downtrodden, as someone who fully understands redundant masculinities and brings revenge back to the sovereign against the unrightful dismissal of the redundant masses, if you will. In addressing things as straightforwardly as Hillary Clinton did, condemning, again in words, the redundant to their own redundancy, obviously she didn't consider the role that many people would argue the social elites have in making the redundant. How can somebody who can be read as a representative of coastal elites be so self-righteous in condemning those who know that they're economically and socially redundant to that very redundancy, without ever taking into account how the economical developments that turn one class of people into economically redundant masses at the very same time lifts others up into positions of privilege, or further confirms them. Can you not acknowledge that when condemning the obvious? I don't share that view, I don't share that opinion, but it's I think the pitfall of the moralist upper middle class subjects are clearly exemplified here. So it seems it's a situation where on the one hand you have the imaginary identification of people with the hordes of the underprivileged for good or bad reasons, and on the other hand you have the swift condemnation of the person who seems to represent a social elite for describing the situation in a rather one-sided way. Saying that, I have no idea what a more complex way of doing that would be, especially not in the run-up to an election. But I'm just harking back to the initial observation that to bring back the plot, if you will, to bring back the plot of the knight in shining armor against the undeniable presence of the monster will not necessarily help, because if you're already condemned to the space of monstrosity, either by your own choice or by the way how the economy has destroyed your lives, reintroducing the plot, the moral tale, the motivational tale of the knight in shining armor, when they hit low, we hit high, is really not gonna help anyone. Which leaves the question over, like, how from a perspective of social justice, from a leftist perspective, one could even address the realities of social redundancies without falling back to the age-old moral tale. And I feel like Sayak Valencia is doing big steps into that direction. So in that space opened up between this impossible choice of an attraction to the lived reality of the monster and the moral tale of the chivalrous man prevailing. What else is there? And here I'm gonna make a sharp cut and move from the global scenario I've just rolled out and the questions that it leaves for political positionings on the larger scale towards the world of, what can I say, my memories, my own relations, the way I've learned to relate to my body and relate to my body while facing the terms of a moral plot which I may or may not have fully internalized. So bear with me, this is a rough cut, a switch over from trying to relate a global problem via the perspectives opened up by Sayak Valencia to a bit of storytelling and image collaging by which I want to approach the question of how I relate to the tale of knights and the knight's nemesis, knights and monsters, moral men and alive, violent bodies, if you will. And by bringing back a figure that in the current popular imagination, if you still understand the products of Disney Plus as having a bearing on what people dream of after they watched it before going to bed, I gonna bring it back to Star Wars for a bit. That was kind of huge for me, being born in the 70s, growing up in the 80s, technically Generation X, if you will. And the body I fell in love with without actually fully morally acknowledging it. So as an only child, I was showered with toys, I have to admit, and it turns out that in retrospect, I have to say one of my favorite toys of all toys was the little action figure of Boba Fett, which you got from the Kenner Star Wars toys. Here you have him, like, amazing body, and that toy set on in my hands, I should say, not so much on my shelf, spent a lot of time in my hands, next to other figures that I guess as a kid I also understood were the protagonists of a moral plot and a plot of moral choices, if you will. And while I was trying to figure out the tale and repeating it to myself, endlessly retelling the story of the movie to myself in my own playtime daydreams, I was exploring these figures with my hands, so that while I was fascinated by the symbolism of this world, at the same time my hands were exploring these little playthings, and somehow my fingers still know these toys as strong as I know my own body, maybe even stronger, because long term, before I even started exploring my own body, I was intensely exploring these playthings, these toys, I should say. So in the moral universe, the plot of the knight and its nemesis, if you will, the story was pretty straightforward. You got the good boy, then you got the scoundrel, and you got the princess. And much as in the Uccello painting, you as a kid, you get confused. You know, you feel like, what if my entire education tells me I have no choice but to choose to be the good boy, when what the movie also tells me, what the pictures also tell me, is that while the good boy gets his dad's lightsaber, the scoundrel is loved by the princess, much like the dragon is loved by the princess. So it's confusing, no? Like what on the level of symbolic choices, there is no choice. You got to be the good guy. No, because only the good guy can in the end decide the difference between good and evil by inheriting his father's lightsaber. He thereby also inherits the symbolic mandate to prevail over decision of good or evil. In the end, he even prevails over his own dad, and against his father's choice to become evil, he brings him back to the good side. So whatever Lacan says about the structural symbolic significance of the phallus is realized here by the lightsaber, insofar as the phallus is just a symbolic mandate. The moment you have the scepter, with that scepter you can draw the line, you can cut through reality and separate reality into good and bad. That is the role of the phallic object. It's the scepter that confirms your symbolic mandate to be the sovereign, that distinguishes between good and evil. And here in that movie it's so dramatic, because in the end Luke Skywalker decides over the good and evil of his own father, bringing him back to the good side, splitting the good father away from the bad father, the emperor, in an act of heroic self-sacrifice, if you will, that earns him the lightsaber. So if you want to enter the symbolic order, you got and have a choice between good and evil, you have no choice but to be with the good boy here, because he will inherit the scepter that allows him to prevail over moral choices. So while on the other hand, he gets no action. That's all for the scoundrel. The love, the bodily affection, the proximity, the humor, the giggling together, all of that is for the scoundrel and for the rogue princess. They have the life-affirming energies. They have life on their side as they fall in love beyond and before morality. But as we know, I don't know, good girls go to heaven, bad girls go to Amsterdam, or to the Millennium Falcon. That is where life takes place, in this order, in this choice, where there is no choice between finding your attraction to the one who inherits the scepter to become moral, and those who have a life. Lacan speaks often about this false decision between your money or your life. You can either have a career or a life, and here it's your morals or your life. An impossible choice, because what can you do? Yes, of course, I identified with Luke Skywalker, while jealously playing with Princess Leia and Han Solo, which was weird because that Han Solo figure, while it had a disturbingly small head, also had very slippery, slinky legs. So there was something kind of really slippery, rubbery about touching Han Solo's legs. I still have that memory in my fingers, those kind of slinky, rubbery legs, long before I ever saw Luke's interior of the Cramps perform in rubber pants on stage. I already kind of had this kind of strange attraction to Han Solo's slinky legs, of that strangely, attractively abject figure, if you will. But to bring it back to Boba Fett, while on the level of the moral plot, you had the false choice between morality or life, if you will, on another level, which no morals can actually fully encompass, I have to say, to my touch, the most attractive body in the whole set was the body of Boba Fett. Like the dragon, that body was all kind of nubbed and ribbed and studded. There was so much to the texture of that body, because he has all of these technical appliances and prostheses. He's got rockets on his arm, as you can see there. He's got lots of, like a really interesting belt thing, like with lots of pockets. And he's got his rocket packs, and in the pockets on his in these kind of utility pans. He's got all kinds of stuff there still that has a super interesting texture. So plus the helmet with its with its round back and kind of sharp front was incredibly attractive to feel. The legs and moving the arms with all the appliances. You can spend forever massaging your boba, if you will. Plus Boba Fett's spaceship, which luckily I got for as a birthday present, was infinitely fascinating because it allowed you to go from horizontal to vertical with a swiveling chair for the pilot that he was lying in resting position, and then when you went up it would swivel into an upright position, and you don't need to be much of a Freudian to relate this rise from the horizontal to the vertical to some bewildering sense that might befall you as a boy when you're dealing what's happening with your erections, if you will. So that there was a kind of almost a direct translation of this bodily sense of bewilderment into kind of a mechanical paraphrase that for the moment at least made it feel like you can have a purchase on what the hell is happening to your body. No? There is an erection machine, which is the Boba Fett spaceship, which you can hold and fly with through your playroom and massage the figure to understand what possibilities a body might have, which beyond and before any moral narrative of good boy, father, son, and scoundrel, here you had a lived experience of bodily possibilities, what it means to go into the vertical, what it means to have a body that's capable of fantastic things. But all, I guess, in the sign of the machinic. So if we come back to metallic or metal masculinities, at least speaking of myself and for myself, I have to say the paraphrase of my own bodily bewilderments and possibilities into a mechanical man was very, very attractive. What can this body do that I happen to find myself in? Oh my God, like what if it could fly? What if I could shoot rockets? What if I could kind of have fire erupting from my fist and have like an unlimited supply of gadgetry in my various pockets? What if I was the perfect performance machine, the perfect improviser as a performance machine? I have to say, as a kid, I also bonded with my dad over a visit to the circus where, and I wish I could remember the name, it was a clown from Russia, and the sketch was about like some kind of disciplinary subject taking all the clown's toys away. So he would start playing on a trumpet, and then this disciplinary agent would come in and take the trumpet away. Then he would maybe try and ukulele somehow from his garments he produced it, and that would be taken away. And then he would produce more and more smaller and smaller musical instruments from his garments whenever the agent of discipline would take it away. And I would always say like, hop on, daughter, I have others. So the father of all improvisation, and my father being a performance artist and big time into improvisation, we were laughing so hard, and it was this kind of strange bonding over the idea of an undisciplinable improviser who has an infinite repertoire of tricks and toys up his various sleeves and pockets. So yeah, Boba Fett as someone who eludes the limitations brought by the law, if you will. But as a mechanical man, obviously, potentially also one version of what Marcel Duchamp in his Great Glass paraphrased as the chocolate grinder masculinities. That's, I think, if I remember correctly, in the top part of the Great Glass, where he was making lots of jokes about modern masculinity based on an over-identification with the machinery, with the high performance qualities that machines have, and which as a man you always lack, but dream of embodying, becoming, overcoming your bodily insufficiencies, and becoming part of the heavy metal machinery, which is a joke that the Duchamp shared and probably also got from the Baroness von Freytag-Loringhofen, who in her mockeries of modern masculinity has a lot of poems ridiculing man over-identifying with the rigor of the machine. And that on the one hand, her sister piece to the Pissoir, which she probably gave to Duchamp, is a little bit is a bit of plumbing, called God, almost like a twisted erection, reducing man to the inefficiency or efficiency of a piece of lost plumbing. And I have to say, like, for me, one match to chocolates, to Duchamp's chocolate grinders in terms of a mockery of mechanical metal masculinities is the Baroness's ode to orgasmic toast, or an orgasmic toaster, which you see represented here on the side, where the she speaks about omnipotency generators that have internal exhausts, and thereby create orgasmic potency out of their sheer mechanical being, which she mocks in that poem beautifully so, which I would take as an analysis of probably what I experienced as a kid, where the machinery or the machinic man offered a moment to imagine my otherwise bewildering body as coherent, and dream of commanding my own and discovering my own potentials, like you would discover and operate a multifunctional machine, as you see here. With, like, isn't that awesome? Like, all the things that your body could do, like from fire to flight to shooting ropes and tying up the good boy, because you're using technology. You got gadgets, you got moves, you can improvise. You have andere. Like, there's an unlimited generative potential to the omnipotency of the improvising mechanical man. How fucking awesome is that? At the same time, when we bring it back to the moral plot of who's gonna inherit the Dark Father's scepter, Boba Fett famously doesn't play along. In the moment when he gets his job assignment to hunt down the scoundrel Han Solo, he's infamously not impressed by the appearance of the Dark Father, Darth Vader. He just, it's a situation, what you want, got a helmet too. And by the way, I've got more gadgets than you ever will. So he's not intimidated by the Father. He doesn't fear the Father. That is Boba's role. And even though he has kind of, 2 minutes 30 of screen time in The Empire Strikes Back, him being famously unfearful, unintimidated by the arrival of the Sovereign, I think probably endeared his character to many, 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 with the effect that the fearless one had to be punished and consigned to death in The Return of the Jedi, which I think for many people of my generation never was fully convincing. How can you kill off the most awesome character on the cast? By the way, I have his toy and I refuse to throw the toy into this big anus in the desert that he was kind of cast into and consumed by. From the great artist Martin White in Oslo, I learned about the American comic code, which he it's a part of his research project Big Science, where he cites the American comic code from the 50s, I think it is, where in the code for editorial matters it's stated that criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. Point 5. Point 6. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. That was the moral codex that in the States was imposed on the popular imaginary of comic book production. And you can't help but feel a certain resonance here, where they realize probably in The Empire Strikes Back, Boba Fett was presented for emulation as actually quite glamorous. So his misdeeds needed to be punished. What misdeeds? That he stood up fearlessly to the Father, if you will, and somehow was unplaceable in the moral order, being neither the good boy nor the scoundrel, but an improvising, mechanical man on the sidelines of the plot, if you will. Yeah. So he met a deliberately a dismal death. A death that doesn't even qualify as in any way heroic. It's just for a laugh. Han Solo, half blinded by being frozen in carbonite, accidentally hits the rocket pack, which then explodes, hurls Boba Fett against Jabba the Hutt's sail barge, whereupon he just drops into this sort of great big asshole in the desert, and that's it. Yeah. So it's a really dishonorable death to a figure that fails to apply by the rules of moral distribution and is incredibly glamorous in doing so. Yeah, but the knight needed to die, and maybe this is a moment as good as any to speak about the inevitability of the metal man to seal his life by dying. A plot that almost reunites the one who doesn't play by the rules with the overall moral landscape, by virtue of the need that all men who wear helmets must die to confirm their faith, if you will. And one of the most amazing films, and before Herzog shot his movies on necromasculinity, if you will, is Robert Bresson's Lancelot du Lac, which is a complete masterpiece when it comes to the appearance of metal moral man, and it's very, very subtle in its deconstruction of that masculinity, because again it offsets the plot of fraternity and betrayal by the consistent absurdity of the movie's audio throughout the entire movie. Whatever the characters say, articulating their moral dilemmas and reminding themselves, each other, to stand forth and be forthright in their morality, is the incessant sound of their armor. The metal sound is, in all its banality, is not filtered away. It's constantly kept present, and I would argue deliberately, by Bresson. So throughout the movie you have this incessant clattering, clatter of the armor of those men who are not so much protected because they die like flies, but almost constrained inside the tin cans of their own moral codex. And those tin cans, on the level of sonic tactility, if you will, is constantly rendered present. You could say Lancelot du Lac is a great movie about, tin cans on horses, and those tin cans are full of blood, And when they meet their destiny, it's usually in a relatively profane way. There's the famous or infamous opening scene of Lancelot du Lac, where in a moment of rivalry, they looking for the Holy Grail. They start killing each other, and two opponents fight. One loses the sword, and the other just unceremoniously decapitates his opponent. So, and then you hear the of the blood spouting from the decapitated stump. It's really, really bad special effects, but precisely in its profanity, it's so spine-chilling, and it ends with everyone dying. It's almost like in Herzog's Aguirre, the Wrath of God, where in the end, on this raft, everybody just withers away. Here, the codex of the man in shining armor is that they need to meet their death together. It's almost as if their bond of faith is of fate, I should say, is only properly sealed the moment that they spill the blood from inside the tin box, if you will. Something that is also famously ridiculed in Monty Python's the Black Knight sketch in The Knights of the Coconut, which is a one-to-one spoof of the fight scenes in Lancelot du Lac, and it takes so little for Breton's grotesque to be pushed into Monty Python's satire. It's just like a tiny bit. It's already grotesque in the original, not just because the death making that seals their fate is exposed in all its absurdity, but because there is the sound that is added to the picture and undercuts the moral narrative, because it constantly renders the impediment, the sound of the impediment of these pieces of metal armor tangible. This is really metallic, machinic, moral masculinity in all of its absurdity. So this is for one of the opening scenes where Lancelot greets his brothers in arms, and you hear how their greeting is followed up by the sound of their moral being.
Salut Lambec, salut Bord.
There's a scene later in the movie where King Arthur admonishing his remaining knights to, stand fast, keep training, exercise their powers, and continue being these kind of arbiters of morality, and which is also followed by a ridiculous amount of clitter-clatter from the armor. Here we go.
Je veux que vous restiez sous les armes. Exercez-vous, perfectionnez-vous. Surtout, restez unis. Oubliez vos querelles. Ne négligez rien qui entretienne l'amitié.
So it's almost like these moral metal men live in a cutlery shop and of their own right, and the only end that the man in the metal tent can find is spill his blood, and do so together as a confirmation of a brotherhood in arms, and it's indiscriminate. The villains and the good ones all meet their rightful end, which the moment they case themselves up in metal is what is an end they must meet, and where necro empowerment combines in the end the fate of the knight and the endriago subject, if you will, they are subject to a common currency, and that currency is blood. So the moral order of masculinity, despite the plot of the night prevailing at the end, is an economy of death and a currency of blood, as Robert Bresson, with incredible imagery, makes it clear. It, on a certain level, the moral admonitions are always offset by the reminder that men clad in metal pay in blood, if you will. Yeah, so there's a common currency to that economy, it seems, irrespective of which side you take. But one more time back to Boba, who was brought back for the entertainment of probably Generation X, who never could live with the fact that he had to pay for his moral insolence of being fearless vis-a-vis the father with his rather unhonorable death. So on the one hand, at the beginning of the TV series, or like the streaming series, I should say, on Disney Plus, the Book of Boba Fett, he fights himself out of the intestines in the desert and bites himself out and finds another exit from this kind of intestinal inside, arises again from the desert, once more defies the moral order of that consigns him to paying in blood for wearing the knight's armor, if you will, because a proper knight has to die, and yeah, well, hopefully a more honorable death than being sucked into this big desert ass. But so he makes his way out, and then the script writers have a problem. If he's now survived again the dictates of the comic code and the moral order that everyone who's glamorous in an amoral sense must be punished, what do we do with this resurrected character? And oh my God, was I longing for seeing this body in action again. No, the improviser, the person who wields his lance freely, a freelancer, if you will, a bounty hunter, freelancing his way through the galaxy, being bound by no loyalty to God or country. Oh my God, what could he be? Now he's back from under the desert. Could he not live a life in freedom and improvise? Unfortunately, that was not to be, because the moral tale, the moral plot that he got tied back into, again, was now a management scenario. That he, with Jabba the Hutt, the big gangster kingpin, dead in the desert, someone needs to take his throne, he takes over, and then the question is, can you be a good endriago subject? Can the endriago subject renegotiate the predicament of sovereignty and become a good ruler in this desert country? Can the improviser, the performer, the freelancer, based on his experience of having no straightforward ideology to back him up, can he be a better boss, if you will? So much of the season is spent with him negotiating with the next generation of millennial hipsters, a generational contract over how they're gonna define the terms of their solidarity against the real big gangsters. Obviously he's old, they're young, and so what do the Gen Xers have to say to the millennials? Or maybe he's even a boomer, God knows, God forbid. So he has no ideological or moral grounds to assert his kind of sovereignty, so he has to improvise, negotiate, and at the end of the day, it almost feels like it's the moral agenda of a tech company, where somebody, probably my generation, would have to negotiate with the much more savvy kids over why on earth they should still be running the show. It's a little bit unentertaining at best, but it seems to be a moral question that's on the agenda today, which is one of generational justice, where the endriago, almost endriago subject, for the kids that love kind of improvisation in civic societies, where that character suddenly is repurposed for basically discussing justice at the workplace, if you will. Again, the actual attraction moves over, as you also see here, to the actress Ming-Na Wen, who's portraying the bounty hunter Fennec Shand, who's basically Boba Fett's right hand. And like in the original, she ain't talking much, so she doesn't say too much. She's just kicking ass like there's no tomorrow. And so here again, the improvised executive power, if you will, of the performer moves from the supposed center of the plot, who discusses the rightful inheritance of power, the right to wield the phallus and tell right from wrong, and be the ruler who puts down the law in a different way. All that moral drama that kind of the beautiful character of Boba Fett is caught into now, leaves the even more beautiful character of Fennec Shand, played by Ming-Na Wen, over to inherit actually the attraction of being a kick-ass mover and performer with a very, very keen senses, who moves swiftly and gets shit done. Unfortunately, like Boba Fett in the original movies, she rather stays on the sideline, and while being universally awesome, she has very little character development scripted into her persona here. The whole dilemma, the whole discussion around kind of generational justice between boomers or Gen Xers and millennials returns in so many movies at the moment, so I'm going to bring it up again. Here is from the last sequel of The Matrix, I forget what it's called, Resurrection or something, which is very much about the new kids bringing back daddy and mommy from the generation that started Silicon Valley, basically putting them to the test. Do you still have something to offer after you've created a new world of cyber capitalism? Can you still tell right from wrong? Can you still set it right? Or have programmer daddy and mommy lost their way? Yeah, exactly. And yeah, well, Keanu Reeves is in the end still kicking it, but he needs a reminder from the next generation much. And this scenario has now been repeated so many times that it feels like one more moral obsession at the moment is whether the old guard, and the old guard by now being boomers or Gen Xers, whether they can still wield the phallus and tell right from wrong, inherit the mandate of symbolic power to distinguish between the right and the wrong way. And so many members of the new generation are brought in to remind them, and the viewers from that generation, I'm assuming this is just targeted at people like me, reminder that they haven't lost their mojo yet. And even though this most mocked and hated scene in the last row sequence of Disney Star Wars films, where Luke Skywalker, when offered the scepter, hurls it behind him, has remained in really bad memories for many. The attempts to heal that insult by having the adverse scenario in the Obi-Wan series has maybe done a little bit to console my generation, that when reminded by their daughters or symbolic kids, they can still like character played by like Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, be set back on the way towards reclaiming their symbolic mandate of telling the difference between right and wrong. This seems to be the moral plot, the intergenerational plot that is being reused in so many movies to probably entertain those who are now in middle age and post-middle age and have once identified with these characters. But why are we wasting time on this when actually what we're discussing is the awesomeness of a fearless freelance performer and whatever happened to him? One inheritor of the fearless improviser, besides Fennec Shand, is Sabine Wren, who fans might know from the animated, or kids might know from the animated series Rebels. Sabine Wren being a renegade daughter of the House of Wren, a true Mandalorian kick-ass character who is not only like Fennec Shand, highly experienced at close range combat, has all the gadgets that Boba had, is exceptionally fearless, has quite some attitude. She's also extremely scientifically and technically educated. She can fix everything, build everything, and then she also has artistic talents on top. As you can see, she is very good with a spray paint gun, and also the author of what was then to become the Rebel logo of the Rising Phoenix, if you will. So universally talented, quintessentially awesome, totally kick-ass in each and every way. She is a constant presence in the Rebels animated series. However, like Fennec Shand, even though she gets quite a bit of screen time, again, the script doesn't really give her much of a character development. There is maybe 1 or 2 episodes when she finds the Darksaber that would technically make her the queen and rightful leaders of the Mandalorians, when she inherits the scepter. That there is an episode or 2 when she's being trained to wield it, but then the main plot line is actually the becoming of Ezra Bridger, the young male lead. You can see him on the right here. He goes from being a fumbling, awkward teenager, street boy, to a Jedi, of course. So his teachings, him being taught, his becoming is the main moral plot of the series, and she is mainly there to offset his awkwardness, if you will. Bringing, I'm assuming, people who would present as male back to these awkward scenes in puberty when you feel like, while you are overwhelmed by the inconsistencies of your own body, you probably feel your female classmates have a head start because they seem to be so much more apt and informed about what their body can do, which is how I experienced it. And chatting with friends, I feel like I might share that experience with quite some people, like this quintessential moment in the sports lesson where you are just full of fear and don't know how the body will get together, and produce kind of awkward accidents on the high bars. Like in my case, she was called Ruth Schafrath. Ruth would kind of just go to the high bars and just with incredible magical powers hurl her body around these kind of metal bars in the air, and be equipped with universally awesome superpowers, which is how it presents itself to you as a boy in puberty. Myself in that moment, it seems just like a total utter miracle that on the one hand seems infinitely attractive, and then at the same time reminds you of your insufficiencies, if you will. I know that the story will be told different from being in Ruth's body and experiencing these powers and other predicaments along with it, but from this sort of puberty perspective that I happen to have, it seems like something that is the ultimate sheer awesomeness, and while at the same time something that shames you and reminds you of your bodily insufficiencies. And while in the much quoted mirror scene that Lacan ascribes to a infant, where you see you feel the incongruousness of your own body in relation to something that seems much more coherent as a mirror image that suddenly becomes your rival. Your own body in the mirror, it seems much more coherent than how you feel. I feel like, apart from the fact that is just such a strange analytic fantasy, I would argue one of the much more plausible moments when something like that happens in a heteronormative system is when, in sports lessons, maybe around age 14 or something, you feel your body mirrored by a female body that suddenly seems to be powered in ways that you have no ways of understanding. A misprojection, a misrecognition, of course, but I would argue not so much of an infant in front of the mirror, but I would say an adolescent boy in front of his imaginary counterpart here. And somehow that would be my 5 cents on how, at the moment, a lot of these characters that are supposedly representing strong women written by male scriptwriters very often, I would argue, echo that fantasy, that pubescent fantasy of projecting all of your inadequacies onto what you in that moment perceive as a much stronger, universally powered body, coded in your own aspirations, coded feminine, which would seem like a perspective of admiration, but insofar as it includes shame, is also a potentially toxic perspective. So I feel like a lot of male writers writing these powered supposedly female characters, in echoing, I would argue, their teenage fantasies, are doing no one a service. It's really not feminist to imagine universally powered creatures, because the fallout of the shame, the memories of shame and embarrassment that will always produce in the internally teenage boy in you is toxic. So why are boys still imagining the awesomeness of girls in these kind of universally powered but entirely undifferentiated ways, if you will, which on the one hand creates strong characters but who are locked into a role where they cannot develop because all they can embody is something that falls from the sky, where there's no explanation, no narrative, no attractive narrative to relate to in terms of a becoming, of a coming to power. They just fly around the high bars, enabled by some superpower. I think it's a male fantasy. I think it's supposed to be an admiration, but I think it's deeply problematic as a projection of power onto a body that is thereby blocked from going through a narrative of becoming. Having said that, the real-life action series Ahsoka is going to start at the end of this month. I'm counting the days, and it seems like one major plot line is going to be Ahsoka teaching Sabine Wren. So maybe script writers have identified this pitfall, and maybe the question of coming to power, not just falling from the sky onto the magical high bars. Maybe there's going to be a revision. Maybe there's an understanding that the coming to power narrative cannot just be that of an awkward fumbling teenage boy inheriting the lightsaber, but maybe there's a narrative of coming to awesomeness and the struggles that implies. We'll see. I'm so curious. Yeah, exactly. What about giving Fanny Chant her own series? Really. Maybe I'm already coming to the end, like the final thoughts here. Some of these thoughts on the absence of the teachings, they are also I first stumbled across them in a fantastic review of the Mulan live action remake written by Jingan Yong in the Guardian in 2020, September 2020, where she was arguing that the real live action remake is different from the original animated Mulan movie, which Jingan Yang embraces as really subversive in many ways, because Mulan, the woman warrior and protagonist, is deprived of any time of becoming, any time of learning. She just, as I was just describing, emerges already powered, can jump, can fly, can fight. No time needs to be wasted on her discovering her own powers. And which is true. I think that she has a very strong point, and that directs you back to the original movie, which is so strong because it imagines education. It imagines the moment of coming to power, not just as a symbolic transaction, where it's decided who gets to wield the phallus, who gets to wield the scepter that gives you the mandate to distinguish right from wrong, but as a scenario where realizing, experiencing your own powers is a process in which the symbolic order of right from wrong, telling right from wrong, is extremely unstable. Funnily enough, in the original Mulan, it's precisely Ming-Na Wen, who's now playing Fennec Shand, who's giving a voice to Mulan, while her sidekick, teacher, tutor, Mushu, the dragon Mushu, is voiced by Eddie Murphy, and together they're just this is just amazing. Precisely because also Mushu, the dragon, accidentally dismembers the honorable family tradition dragon. It's an accident in the beginning, and then has to fill in for the rightful educator family spirit by again being a improviser, harpander. He's Mushu never runs out of suggestions, tricks and suggestions, mainly because very often he doesn't know either. So the two of them figure stuff out together on this path to becoming powered, which is an educational zone where the symbolism of good and evil is conspicuously absent, because what they actually do is improvise together a hell of a lot. And this is for another talk. Spending so much time teaching, I'm really, really, really interested in the figure of the untrustworthy teacher. There's a lot written about the untrustworthy narrator, where you don't know whether the voice that you're following in a novel is actually good or bad. But I think there's many traditions of spiritual learning where the teacher receives the mandate for teaching not in a phallic way by getting the scepter to tell right from wrong, but because the teacher operates in a zone where it's unclear what is foolish and what is wise, what is good, what is bad, where for instance in the Mahabharata epos, the teacher of the protagonist Arjuna is actually Krishna, a maker of many worlds. So I think he probably, because once he's making worlds, he makes many at the same time. I think Krishna probably inhabits 32 universes at the same time. The number might be wrong, I'm sorry, don't quote me on that. So he's highly unreliable in many ways. You never know whether Krishna fools you for a pedagogical purpose or because can't help it. But still the Arjuna chooses Krishna in a decisive moment over the assurance of military superiority, because he wants to be in that zone where many worlds exist in parallel, and the being with a spirit that is not entirely unreliable but opens up many parallel worlds is more attractive. if you will. There would be a lot to unpack here in terms of implications for pedagogy. What if your professor, what if your partner, your traveling companion doesn't receive their mandate by virtue of receiving the scepter, the lightsaber, that is the phallic divider of good from bad, but because they are with you as traveling companions in that kind of strange zone of learning, of coming to power, if you will. Yeah. Here, Muchu, Eddie Murphy, next to Mulan Ming-Na Wen, figuring stuff out in what I would actually describe as a situation of performative improvisation that has fairly little to do with a phallic mandate, if you will. But then the phallic mandate is back, and these are just a few notes on the third idea of like a chivalrous handover of power, which has been again a standard trope in so many popular movies at the moment. Yeah, on the one hand there is Rey handing the scepter, the phallic scepter, back to the aged, disgruntled Skywalker, and echoing that gesture, you have Mando Din Djarin, the Mandalorian, in the popular series The Mandalorian, handing over the Darksaber, who got to him from Sabine Wren, to Bo-Katan, House of Creed, who is, am I messing this up? Bo-Katan, I should stay with that, who is making her the rightful leader of the Mandalorians, and the last season was all about that, creating a backdrop for that symbolic moment when legitimacy is, as a leader, is bestowed upon her through the handing over of the saber, of the scepter, if you will, in an extremely awkward situation where the metal moral man still insists on his powers to bestow legitimacy upon the rightful queen. It's in the series, it's a strange plot construction where by rights she would have to kill him to get the saber, so we can't do that. There's a moment when some monster captures him, so he loses the saber, and then she saves his ass, and so technically he has already gone through symbolic death. So by killing the monster, she has killed the one that has symbolically killed him, so that's why she is the rightful of the owner of the saber anyway, so the symbolic transaction is actually no transaction. So it's a kind of strange legal scenario, which is the best that the scriptwriters can come up with to, in the end, give us this picture where the infinitely attractive Din Djarin hands over the saber to the no less kick-ass Bo-Katan, who unfortunately is trapped in the same plot place where she is emerges universally kick-ass, has a depressed moment, gets back on top when she leads the Mandalorians. But again, it's not like with Mulan, where they would accompany each other, or where the fact that they accompany each other in moments of learning, which they kind of do, where that would be the meaningful moment that would lend credibility to her as much as to him. It still takes that kind of strange symbolic transaction where the phallic scepter is handed over for legitimacy to be bestowed upon her. They could have just also completely forgotten about it, to be honest. Yeah, in the same way that, of course, the last season of the Game of Thrones seemed so bizarre in that they still felt compelled to have an honorable, chivalrous, self-sacrificial move of Jon Snow stepping back, handing over the scepter to Khaleesi, where it felt like, why does she need any symbolic legitimacy? She got dragons, she's kick-ass, like what the hell? We saw her becoming, through many moral challenges, measuring cruelty against justice. We saw her becoming. Why the hell would you end many seasons of following her becomings and learning to fly her dragons, why would that process of learning need to lead to a symbolic transaction, a handover of power, where in the end the legitimacy of Jon Snow doesn't by no means goes over to her. It's actually reconfirmed by his moral position of being the source of symbolic power. Why would it be up to him to legitimize her, if not for the fact that here suddenly the patriarchal order still rules supreme? Her experience of learning and becoming counts for nothing, and when it comes to the final moment of the scepter of power being handed over, why, for F's sake? And obviously at the very end, that is, sorry, plot spoiler, it's a management decision that is instantly revoked the moment that a symbolic mandate comes to her. She goes mad, and for justice to be reinstalled, he then takes the sword that is no longer a scepter to symbolically put her to death, so that the only legitimation she can find, in, as we have learned, is also for her to pay with her blood in that economy of necro-legitimacy, if you will. And if an entire season pointed beyond that, why would you re-invoke that? And this is for the Germans in the house. I have to confess the party that I've always voted because I sympathize with them for making the same idiotic mistakes that I probably was raised to make myself. And this is the German Green Party, Die Grünen, where they initially went into the game, the last elections, as a double-headed monster with Anna Baerbock and now I'm in the English word, I can't remember his name, Robert Habeck. And at one point it was clear that only one of them could get the symbolic mandate of being the sovereign of their own party. And then during a congress, he symbolically handed over the scepter of being the head of the party to her. I'm sure it wasn't conscious, but effectively it meant that while she was already not particularly popular in the public eye in Germany for being perceived as a very ambitious woman, and there were some allegations of her, I don't know, faking stuff in a recent publication, and of plagiarism. So like the general resentment directed towards her as someone who didn't earn her position of power, misogynistic in many ways. It wasn't really alleviated by the fact that he grandiosely wielded the moral power of chivalrously handing over power to her, as if that source of symbolic was somewhere hidden inside his genes, yeah? So that he could, blue jeans, could hand it over to her to legitimize her, so that rather than a situation of shared experience and learning about sharing power, there was still a theater of a patriarchal sovereignty where some kind of symbolic gesture needed to be performed, which doesn't just happen once. And I don't know why the Green Party can't hire a body coach. And in German there's a term called Fremdschämen, that is, yeah, you probably know it, when you're embarrassed on other people's behalf, and it's really physical. Whenever I see the two together, I shiver, I get goosebumps out of embarrassment, because somehow in performing the understanding emancipated Gen X man, he still occupies in terms of his body language, the active part of bestowing attention, symbolic attention upon the other. He keeps pointing at her, and even in moments when he suggests that he honors her with taking her seriously, his body language of look, I'm listening, is so active. He's leaning in when he's listening, that the moral recognition of being acknowledged as a man who has really, really learned how to be a different man, this signal is much stronger than anything she could ever send out. It sometimes seems when you see them together, and it feels this is precisely the pitfalls of understanding chivalrousness as a feminist move. It's not. Chivalry is part and parcel of an economy of blood where men in metal tins bestow upon each other the symbolic mandate to tell right from wrong. This is patriarchy. Stop it. Being chivalrous is not nice. In that moment, he is actually undercutting her very performance, her ability to, out of a situation of learning about power, come to the right decisions and not be legitimized in that by a chivalrous man. I'm saying that as a reminder because I think in many, many ways, probably as my mother's little knight in armor, I grew up thinking that actually being a chivalrous sidekick could actually be a feminist stance. And it's wrong. The whole symbolic logic of legitimation that's inherent to that is fundamentally unwarranted, if not effectively toxic. So to all the knights, I don't think chivalry is the way to go. Right. So what else is there? If on the one hand we have the economy of blood, that comes with the symbolism of death, the industry of death on the one hand, and the codes of legitimacy among tin-canned guys with blood under metal. If we dispose of that, what is there? And I can't help thinking it's maybe it's a zone of learning. And a zone of learning where beyond symbolic legitimacy, before and beyond, experiences made together count. And that could be experiences of challenges, but it could also really be experiences of happiness, where in the Muju Mulan example, yes, we're still talking mentor and aspiring fighter, but what if we also do away with that if there's moments of learning together where the patriarchal matrix of legitimacy is twisted beyond recognition or just falls away. To not be stuck with the analysis of the toxic, I can just for a moment also share a moment of my happiness, where recently I've been recruited brought in by Krista Papista, fantastic musician, to play as a sideman on bass for her live performances, which we do decked out in a lot of heavy metal, which is goat bells she bought from Greece, and which worn as a harness make an infernal noise on top of her electro tough sounds and queering, if you will, a certain kind of traditional aesthetics. Her recent album is called Folklore, reappropriating the heavy metal of tradition to a dance of pain and joy, if you will. And speaking of a zone of learning, it was quite a bit of a challenge being in that zone together, learning to perform with the bells when you're performing to a very tight electronic beats, and you need to move in such a way with your body that the bells actually resonate with the music in a way. Being in that stage of, in that zone of mayhem together is just like an extremely strong experience where whatever Boba Fett gadgetry I can bring to the task in terms of sounds and amplification technologies, which you see on the side, together with a pair of wooden shoes with pom-poms that Krista then put on my feet, which makes it extremely difficult to hit switches on a reverb unit, if you will, in this case. Puts you in a strange zone of learning together and re-signifying the tradition of heavy metal. So from the clitter, clatter, clitter, clatter of Bresson, we then suddenly move to the wild sound of goat bells. This is just to point before and beyond analysis to a zone of happiness, of learning together, which I can't help thinking is a better way out, a better way to exit the economy, the symbolic economy of blood and phallic mandates that a lot of chivalrous storytelling and moral plotlining is invariably about, back to the point where the handover that is supposedly ending patriarchy is still imagined in terms of the self-same symbolic economy, which I think to exit would mean to enter a zone where the distinction of right from wrong is not given through a symbolic mandate, but through very material experiences, something sonic, something pictorial, something tactile, where dancing with bells to an electronic groove suddenly opens up a zone of relation that no morality can encompass, if you will. This is not an effective way of speaking, on the one hand, back to the global dominance of an economy of necromasculinity. It's at the same time, because the sheer outreach of the violence that's wielded by that necropower machine is so devastating. At the same time, I feel within the horizon of lived remaking, there is some joy. There is some joy to be found in that moment of ditching symbolic protocols of validation and entering zones of learning together where certain roles on the one hand can become kinky, where the sidekick gets a chain of gold bells around his neck and some pom-poms on his feet, so where symbolic relations are rendered kinky, but where on the other hand zones of experience and learning together open up. And I would just say, like, these are zones of joy that I would embrace, not present symbolically as a solution to anything, but as a space of negotiation that exists beyond and before toxic symbolic protocols and economies of death, where the only currency is blood, no matter on which side you come down.